February 9th, 1945 marked the day when Private Takeshi Yamamoto first witnessed what American soldiers had begun calling their Zippo tanks, a nickname that would haunt the nightmares of every Japanese defender across the Pacific theater. The morning sun cast long shadows across the volcanic ash of Iwo Jima as Yamamoto crouched in his reinforced bunker, clutching his rifle with trembling hands. He had heard the rumors from survivors of Saipan and Peleliu, whispered accounts of mechanical demons that breathed liquid fire, consuming everything in their path. Now, as the rumble of tracked vehicles grew louder above the thunder of naval bombardment, he understood that those stories had not been exaggerations. The M4 Sherman tank, equipped with the flamethrower attachment officially designated the M4A3R3, represented a technological terror that defied every principle of warfare the Imperial Japanese Army had taught its soldiers. These modified Shermans carried 790 gallons of napalm mixture, capable of projecting flames up to 150 yards with temperatures exceeding 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. According to declassified Marine Corps historical records from the National Archives, these flame tanks proved instrumental in reducing fortified positions that had withstood weeks of conventional bombardment. The Japanese defenders had constructed an elaborate network of caves, pillboxes, and interconnected tunnels across their Pacific strongholds, positions designed to withstand artillery and resist infantry assaults indefinitely. The flame tanks shattered this defensive doctrine in minutes. Yamamoto's commanding officer, Captain Hiroshi Tanaka, had assembled his platoon the previous evening to explain their sacred duty. The captain's face remained stoic as he described their mission with the clinical precision expected of an officer trained in the Bushido tradition. "The American flame tanks represent more than weapons," Tanaka had explained, his words carrying the weight of imperial doctrine. "They are instruments designed to break our spirit, to make us abandon our positions without honor. We cannot permit this disgrace." The captain outlined their orders with devastating clarity. Soldiers would employ magnetic mines, satchel charges, and when necessary, their own bodies as weapons to neutralize these threats. Surrender remained unthinkable. Retreat meant dishonor worse than death. The strategic importance of stopping these flame tanks transcended individual survival. Japanese defensive doctrine relied entirely on fortified positions to exact maximum casualties from American forces, hoping to make the invasion of the home island so costly that the United States would negotiate peace rather than pursue unconditional surrender. Each flame tank destroyed meant dozens of defensive positions might hold longer, potentially saving hundreds of lives in the caves and tunnels behind the front lines. The mathematics of sacrifice became grimly simple in commanders' calculations. One soldier's life traded for a flame tank could preserve an entire company's fighting position for days or weeks longer. Yamamoto checked his equipment methodically. 2 magnetic mines secured to his belt, a satchel charge containing 20 pounds of explosives, and a prayer written by his mother tucked inside his helmet. He was 19 years old, had never seen his homeland's cherry blossoms bloom, and would likely not survive the day ahead. Yet, as the first Zippo tank crested the ridge above his position, its barrel rotating toward the cave entrance where his comrades sheltered, Yamamoto felt something beyond fear. The indoctrination, the training, the endless repetition of duty above self had prepared him for this precise moment when personal extinction became the only acceptable response to an impossible enemy. June 15, 1944 brought the flame tank's devastating debut at Saipan, though its psychological impact would not fully manifest until American forces began their island-hopping campaign toward Japan's home islands. Marine Corps engineers had experimented with various flame-throwing devices throughout the early Pacific campaigns, but the marriage of this weapon system to the M4 Sherman tank created something altogether more nightmarish. The Ronson Company and the Chemical Warfare Service collaborated to develop a system that could project ignited fuel far beyond what infantry-carried flamethrowers could achieve, while the tank's armor protected operators from the desperate counterattacks such weapons inevitably provoked. Lieutenant Colonel Robert Cushman, commanding the 2nd Battalion of the 9th Marines, recorded his observations of the flame tank's first major engagement in his after-action report, documents now preserved at the Marine Corps History Division archives in Quantico, Virginia. The psychological effect upon enemy troops exceeded our most optimistic predictions, Cushman wrote. Enemy soldiers who had withstood days of artillery preparation and resisted multiple infantry assaults abandoned positions within minutes of fleeing tank deployment. Those who remained attempted suicidal attacks against the vehicles with whatever weapons available. This pattern would repeat across every subsequent Pacific battle where flame tanks appeared: Tinian, Peleliu, Iwo Jima, and finally Okinawa. The technical specifications of these weapons explain why Japanese soldiers viewed them with such visceral dread. The M4A3R3 mounted an E4-5 flame gun in place of the standard 75mm cannon, fed by two pressurized fuel tanks installed in the hull. The napalm mixture gasoline thickened with aluminum soaps to create a gel that adhered to surfaces burned at temperatures sufficient to melt steel and concrete. More horrifying still, the flames consumed oxygen so rapidly that soldiers in enclosed spaces often suffocated before the fire reached them. Bunkers that had taken weeks to construct, reinforced with coral, concrete, and steel, became crematoriums within seconds of a flame tank's assault. Sergeant Yoshio Nakamura survived the defense of Peleliu's Yumurbagal Mountain, known to Americans as Bloody Nose Ridge, and his testimony provides insight into Japanese tactical evolution against these weapons. Interviewed by occupation forces in 1946, Nakamura described how initial attempts to engage flame tanks with rifle fire proved utterly futile. The metal skin deflected our bullets like raindrops. Artillery strikes might disable one if we achieved direct hits, but our remaining guns faced constant air attack. We learned quickly that only close assault offered any possibility of success. This meant soldiers must approach within meters of vehicles specifically designed to incinerate anyone in their immediate vicinity. The Imperial Japanese Army's tactical manuals, captured documents translated by Allied intelligence officers, reveal the systematic indoctrination that prepared soldiers for such sacrifices. The Senjinkan, or Instructions for the Battlefield, issued by Minister of War Hideki Tojo in 1941, explicitly stated that duty is weightier than a mountain, while death is lighter than a feather. This document formally prohibited surrender under any circumstances, declaring that soldiers must never live to experience shame as a prisoner. Subsequent training reinforced this doctrine. Relentlessly, soldiers practiced assembling satchel charges while blindfolded, rehearsed approaches to mock enemy tanks under live fire, and participated in ceremonies honoring those who died in successful suicide attacks. The Americans gradually recognized that they faced opponents who viewed tactical suicide not as desperation but as the culmination of their martial purpose. Combat reports from Iwo Jima document Japanese soldiers emerging from caves in pairs, one carrying explosives while the other provided suppressing fire during the approach to flame tanks. Some wrapped themselves entirely in explosive charges, transforming their bodies into guided weapons. Others concealed mines in spider holes along tank routes, waiting motionless for hours or days until target vehicles passed overhead, then detonating charges that killed both tank crews and themselves. The mathematics of attrition shifted dramatically. Each destroyed flame tank typically cost the lives of 3 to 7 Japanese soldiers, but preserved defensive positions that might inflict casualties on dozens or hundreds of American infantrymen in subsequent fighting. March 3, 1945 found Corporal Kenji Ishikawa positioned in a camouflage spider hole along the primary approach route to Mount Suribachi on Iwo Jima, waiting for the sound that had become the herald of both terror and opportunity, the distinctive diesel rumble of Sherman tanks moving toward the front lines. Ishikawa had volunteered for tank hunter duty after witnessing a flame tank reduce his entire squad's bunker to molten slag in less than 30 seconds. 14 men who had been his brothers in arms, comrades who had shared rations and letters from home, ceased to exist as individuals and became instead blackened shapes fused to melting coral. The image haunted every moment of his consciousness, transforming grief into a crystalline sense of purpose. The psychological conditioning that enabled such soldiers to function extended far beyond simple military discipline. Dr. Ruth Benedict, the American anthropologist who authored The Chrysanthemum and the Sword in 1946, analyzed captured Japanese military training documents and interviewed numerous prisoners to understand this phenomenon. According to her research, housed in the Library of Congress Special Collections, Japanese military culture embedded the concept of honorable death so deeply into soldiers' identities that survival without glory became a fate literally worse than extinction. This wasn't merely propaganda imposed from above, but reflected centuries of samurai tradition adapted to modern industrial warfare. The shame of surrender or retreat would follow not just the individual soldier, but his entire family, potentially for generations. Ishikawa's training at the 36th Infantry Division camp near Osaka had included repeated exposure to mock tank approaches, while instructors screamed that hesitation meant dishonor to the emperor, to Japan, and to every ancestor whose sacrifice had preserved the nation's independence. Soldiers practiced charging mock-ups of American tanks while live ammunition fired overhead, conditioning them to suppress natural survival instincts. Those who hesitated faced public humiliation, reduced rations and assignments to punishment details. Those who demonstrated proper spirit received praise, extra food, and commendations. Over months, this systematic reinforcement rewired fundamental human psychology, creating soldiers who genuinely perceived self-sacrifice as the highest achievement rather than a tragedy to be avoided. The American military establishment struggled to comprehend opponents who operated under such radically different moral frameworks. Lieutenant General Holland Smith, commanding the 5th Amphibious Corps during the Marianas Campaign, wrote in his memoirs that we faced an enemy who valued death over defeat in ways that defied rational military calculation. Intelligence officers initially dismissed reports of systematic suicide attacks as exaggerations or propaganda, unable to accept that an entire military force could be conditioned to embrace tactical self-destruction. Only after repeated encounters across multiple campaigns did American planners adjust their operational assumptions to account for an enemy who viewed trading individual lives for modest tactical advantages as not merely acceptable but honorable. Ishikawa's spider hole, barely large enough to contain his body and the 40-pound satchel charge, represented the culmination of this tactical philosophy. He had concealed the position with meticulous care over 3 days, ensuring that American reconnaissance would detect nothing unusual. The charge itself, dynamite stolen from mining operations, wrapped in canvas and fitted with a pressure-sensitive detonator, possessed sufficient explosive force to crack a Sherman's hull armor if detonated directly beneath the vehicle. Success required patience, nerve, and acceptance that survival was not merely unlikely but impossible. The explosion that destroyed the tank would certainly kill him instantly. Yet Ishikawa felt no despair, only a strange calm born from absolute certainty of purpose. The strategic context made such sacrifices seem rational within Japanese military planning. Each flame tank destroyed meant infantry attacks would face one less source of overwhelming firepower. If 10 soldiers died eliminating 10 flame tanks, the defensive line might hold an additional week, inflicting thousands of casualties on attacking forces. If the cumulative cost of island invasions became sufficiently terrible, perhaps America would negotiate peace terms that preserved the emperor and avoided complete occupation. This logic, however flawed in retrospect, seemed compelling to commanders who had watched their defensive perimeters shrink with each passing month, who understood that Japan's industrial capacity could never match America's, and who believed that spiritual strength might yet overcome material disadvantage if sufficient sacrifices were made. January 21, 1945, brought Sergeant Dan McCarthy of the 4th Marine Division face-to-face with the reality that had transformed tank warfare in the Pacific Theater into something altogether different from the European experience. McCarthy served as gunner on a M4A3R3 flame tank nicknamed Satan's Breath, and his crew had just suppressed a complex of Japanese pillboxes on Iwo Jima's northern beaches when they encountered their first coordinated anti-tank suicide attack. 3 Japanese soldiers emerged simultaneously from concealed positions, each carrying explosive charges and moving with what McCarthy later described as eerie determination, like they were walking to church rather than certain death. The tank commander, Lieutenant Thomas Brennan, shouted warnings over the intercom as the machine gunner traversed desperately to engage the attackers. The first soldier fell to machine gun fire 20 yards from the tank, his satchel charge detonating prematurely and creating a crater that would swallow 2 men. The second reached the tank's left track before a burst from the coaxial machine gun cut him down, his charge exploding against the track assembly with sufficient force to throw fragments through the air like shrapnel. The third soldier actually made contact with the tank's hull, pressing his charge against the armor before bullets finally stopped him. The explosion rocked the 30-ton vehicle sideways, cracking welds and stunning the crew but failing to penetrate the armor. McCarthy's ears rang for 3 days afterward, but what disturbed him most was the expression he'd glimpsed on the final attacker's face, not fear or rage, but something approaching serenity. American military psychiatrists struggled to develop tactical recommendations for dealing with such opponents. Captain William Menninger, chief consultant in neuropsychiatry for the Surgeon General's office, compiled extensive reports on the psychological impact of facing suicide attackers, documents now available through the National Library of Medicine's historical archives. Menninger noted that American soldiers trained to expect rational tactical behavior from opponents' retreat when overwhelmed, surrender when defeat became inevitable, self-preservation as a primary motivation found Japanese tactical suicide attacks deeply destabilizing. "Our men understand fighting against brave opponents willing to take risks," Menninger wrote. "They cannot comprehend fighting opponents who embrace death as victory rather than viewing it as failure." This psychological dissonance created unexpected challenges for American commanders. Tank crews, already operating in cramped, dangerous conditions under constant artillery fire, now faced the knowledge that enemy soldiers actively sought opportunities to die while destroying their vehicles. The stress manifested in increased combat fatigue, paranoid vigilance that interfered with sleep, and sometimes excessive responses to perceived threats. After several instances where tank crews fired on civilians or surrendering soldiers mistaken for suicide attackers, commanders implemented strict fire discipline protocols and psychological screening for personnel assigned to flame tank operations. Staff Sergeant Robert Henderson, a tank commander who served through Saipan, Tinian, and Iwo Jima, described the evolution of American tactical responses in his oral history recorded in 1998, archived at the Veterans History Project. "Initially, we treated flame tanks like any other armor. Send them forward. Let them crack the bunkers. Infantry follows to mop up," Henderson explained. But the Japanese figured out quickly that those specific tanks were priority targets worth any cost to destroy. By Iwo Jima, we never sent flame tanks forward without extensive infantry screens, air reconnaissance to identify concealed positions, and supporting armor to suppress anti-tank ambushes. One flame tank required more support than an entire platoon of regular Shermans. The tactical chess match between American armor doctrine and Japanese anti-tank suicide tactics evolved throughout the final year of the Pacific Campaign. Japanese defenders learned to position tank traps and obstacles specifically to channel flame tanks into kill zones where multiple suicide attackers could engage simultaneously. American forces responded with combined arms tactics that coordinated infantry sweeps, artillery preparation, airstrikes, and armored advances to minimize exposure of valuable flame tanks. The ratio of casualties shifted early in the campaign. Japanese forces might sacrifice 2 or 3 soldiers to destroy a single flame tank. By Okinawa, the same destruction typically cost 8 to 12 lives as American protective measures improved. Yet certain fundamental asymmetries persisted throughout the war. America could replace destroyed tanks faster than Japan could train soldiers willing to destroy them, but each loss still represented a significant tactical setback and blow to infantry morale. Japanese soldiers willing to conduct suicide attacks represented a theoretically exhaustible but practically renewable resource as long as officers maintained ideological control and soldiers believed such sacrifices served their emperor. New volunteers emerged to replace casualties. This created a strategic paradox where American material superiority proved less decisive than expected, while Japanese tactical desperation produced results beyond what conventional military planning would predict. April 1, 1945 transformed Okinawa into the proving ground where both American flame tank tactics and Japanese anti-tank suicide strategies reached their terrible culmination. Private First Class Harold Schultz maneuvered his M4A3R3 flame tank through the rubble of what had been the village of Kakazu, now reduced to anonymous heaps of shattered concrete and splintered wood. His crew had already expended half their napalm load that morning, reducing 7 bunkers and 3 cave complexes to smoking ruins. The acidic smell of burning petroleum mixed with odors Schultz tried not to identify as he scanned for the next defensive position requiring their attention. The Japanese 32nd Army, under Lieutenant General Mitsuru Oshijima, had prepared Okinawa's defenses with the accumulated lessons of every previous island battle. Captured planning documents, translated by Allied intelligence officers and now held in the National Institute for Defense Studies archives in Tokyo, reveal the systematic allocation of resources toward countering American armor, particularly flame tanks. The Shijima staff calculated that if they could achieve a destruction rate of 1 flame tank per day while inflicting maximum casualties on supporting infantry, the battle might last 4 to 6 months, long enough, they hoped, to convince American planners that invading the Japanese home islands would cost millions of casualties and make negotiated peace more attractive than unconditional surrender. This strategic vision required transforming every soldier into a potential anti-tank weapon. Special training schools operated behind the front lines where infantry received instruction in tank recognition, weak points on American armor, optimal placement of explosive charges, and approaches that maximize surprise while minimizing the window for defensive fire. Volunteers, and there remain genuine volunteers even at this late stage of the war, practiced their attacks repeatedly until the movements became reflexive. Some men developed specialized techniques, such as carrying 2 charges so that if the first failed to detonate properly, the second might still complete the mission. Others worked in pairs, with one soldier drawing defensive fire while the second approached from a blind angle. Corporal Masao Yamashita, one of the relatively few Japanese soldiers who survived the Okinawa campaign and spoke openly about his experiences, in post-war interviews conducted by Japanese historians, described the psychological state required for such missions. "We did not think of it as dying," Yamashita explained in testimony archived at the Okinawa Prefectural Peace Memorial Museum. "We thought of it as completing our purpose. A bullet has one function, to strike its target. A bomb has one function, to explode against the enemy. We understood ourselves the same way. Our training, our entire existence since entering the Army, had prepared us for the single moment when we would fulfill our design. To hesitate, to fail, meant our entire lives had been wasted. Better to succeed and disappear than to survive having accomplished nothing." The American response evolved into a combined arms doctrine that treated flame tanks as extraordinarily valuable assets requiring disproportionate protection. By the Okinawa campaign, standard operating procedure called for each flame tank to be accompanied by at least 2 infantry squads, 1 conventional Sherman tank for direct fire support, and when available, air reconnaissance to identify concealed anti-tank positions before the armor advanced. Engineers preceded tank movements to clear mines and obstacles. Artillery and naval gunfire saturated suspected defensive areas with high explosives before armor entered range. These measures reduced flame tank losses but slowed advances significantly and increased ammunition consumption dramatically. The statistical record of the Okinawa campaign, documented in the official Army historical series Okinawa, The Last Battle, reveals the grim arithmetic underlying these tactics. American forces deployed approximately 60 flame tanks during the campaign, which lasted from April 1st through June 22, 1945. Japanese forces succeeded in destroying or severely damaging 18 of these vehicles, a loss rate of 30%. Each destruction typically cost between 4 and 9 Japanese soldiers' lives, occasionally more when attacks failed or multiple attempts were required. The flame tanks eliminated hundreds of fortified positions that conventional weapons had failed to reduce, potentially saving thousands of American infantry casualties. Yet even as these tactical engagements unfolded, strategic realities were shifting beneath both combatants. By May 1945, American submarines had effectively cut Japan's maritime supply lines, and strategic bombing had reduced much of Tokyo and other major cities to ash. The Soviet Union, bound by agreements made at Yalta, was preparing to enter the war against Japan. Most critically, the Manhattan Project was approaching completion of weapons that would render conventional tactical calculations irrelevant. The soldiers fighting and dying around Okinawa's flame tanks could not know that their sacrifices, however genuine, were occurring in the final weeks of a war whose conclusion would be determined not by tactical excellence or spiritual determination, but by fundamental shifts in the nature of warfare itself. June 10, 1945 found Captain Hiroshi Tanaka, the officer who had ordered Private Yamamoto to his fate 4 months earlier, composing final instructions in the command bunker beneath Okinawa's Shuri defensive line. The battle had evolved precisely as Japanese planners had predicted. American forces had advanced slowly, paid heavily in casualties, and demonstrated increasing frustration at the grinding nature of the campaign. Yet the strategic situation had deteriorated beyond what even pessimistic assessments had anticipated. The Imperial Navy effectively no longer existed as a fighting force. The Air Force had been reduced to kamikaze operations, sacrificing pilots and aircraft in diminishing returns. Most critically, firebombing raids had destroyed more than 60% of Japan's major urban centers, and Tanaka had received reports that conventional bombing now seemed pointless given the scarcity of intact targets. The flame tank campaign on Okinawa had achieved tactical successes that would have seemed impossible earlier in the war. Japanese forces had destroyed or disabled more than 80 of these vehicles through June, an achievement requiring the deaths of approximately 115 soldiers in direct anti-tank actions, plus countless others killed in the defensive positions the flame tanks had eliminated. By any rational calculation, this represented a catastrophic exchange ratio, trading trained soldiers for mechanical systems that American industry could replace within weeks. Yet within the logic of Japanese defensive strategy, these sacrifices made terrible sense. Each day the battle continued meant one more day before American forces could begin preparing for the invasion of Kyushu, one more opportunity for diplomatic intervention, one more chance that America's will might crack under the accumulated cost in blood and treasure. Tanaka's analysis, recorded in his diary and later recovered by occupation forces, reveals the cognitive dissonance afflicting Japanese officers in the war's final weeks. He wrote extensively about the courage of his men, their perfect execution of anti-tactics, and the pride he felt at their willingness to sacrifice everything for emperor and nation. Yet between these passages appeared darker reflections, observations that no amount of spiritual strength could overcome material reality, questions about whether the sacrifices being demanded served any genuine strategic purpose, and carefully worded doubts about whether the military leadership had been honest with ordinary soldiers about Japan's true situation. The soldiers conducting these attacks operated in a different mental space, one where such strategic doubts could not be permitted to intrude. Lance Corporal Takeshi Nakamura, one of the final anti-tank volunteers at Okinawa, left a letter with comrades before his